Section 5. Reconstitution of law. All ostensible law and regulations beyond the existing national constitutions as affected by this Act shall be subject to public affirmation and periodic reaffirmation, to all further conditions established by this amendment, and particularly to an ever-implicit obligation to eradicate all possibility of injustice, however assumed to be isolated, improbable, or minute, and any and every case of failure of the government to provide a full and legitimate accounting to legitimate petitions for redress of grievance or further perfection of the law shall be severe criminal transgression of this Act. Section 6. Judicial obligation. In no court or other body may relevant application of the Constitution be denied, and for any authority, person, court, or body, however ostensibly empowered or otherwise committed, and whether prevailing or not, to have sought to deny relevant application of the Constitution shall be severe criminal transgression of this Act. Section 7. Economy, taxation, and reparation of the consequences of systemic exploitation. It shall be the perpetual and inviolable obligation of all branches, officers, and agents of government to ensure absolute economy, to reasonably minimize the costs of effective government across all cases, to tax the people most directly and automatically for no more than actual services rendered and willfully accepted or consumed, to restrict the burden of costs to those who willfully cause or incur them, and to protect the people, their affairs, national resources, and industry at all times from all possibility of exploitation. Section 7A. Legitimate principles of monetization, crimes of obfuscation. As indispensable matters of solution and transformation to actual and just economy, we are compelled to prove the fundamental faults of the pretended economies which have been imposed upon us. 1. Any definition of money can impose no injustice whatever if and only if every manifestation of the definition preserves an immutable tokenization of represented value in regard to any and every process of the subject system. 1a. If money increases in effective value, then the wealth of property holders or debtors is generally decreased. 1b. If money decreases in effective value, then the wealth of possessors of money is generally decreased. 2. Likewise, a promissory note must sustain this principle of immutable value even to preserve an intrinsic obligation which inherently issues from the debtor in needfully monetizing the property of the actual creditor. 2a. Promissory notes, in fact, then, are such potentially legitimate, immutable tokens of value as may perfectly serve the purposes of currency only when they are strictly promissory notes, and only when, therefore, they are free of any systemic power whatever to alter their realizable value. 2a.1. In the natural life cycle of a promissory note, when its obligation to pay is fulfilled, it is inherently retired from existence because it no longer represents the original obligation which monetized the represented property only until the represented property was paid for. 2a.2. As every fulfilled promissory obligation or payment of principal, therefore, no longer represents an obligation, neither do such units of circulation any longer remain tokens of value. They are null and void upon resolution of the principal. 3. The actual creditor of every such natural arrangement gives up property for a promissory obligation. And so, in fact, the actual creditor is paid in full from the outset and incurs no risk whatever, so long as the integrity of the obligation is immutable and enforced. 3a. A debtor thus promises to increase the pool of wealth so much as the efforts which produced the object of credit, from which pool of wealth the creditor is licensed only by an immutable form of money to purchase at any time whatever equivalent of the object of credit they desire. 3a.1. So long as the possibility of loss to the creditor is eradicated, the debtor therefore does not promise the creditor so much as the value of several objects of credit in case the debtor might fail to pay one. For there is never any risk of loss to the creditor so long as fulfillment is guaranteed by a proper definition of the obligation, or thus a proper definition of money. 3a.2. Nor is it an object of actual economy, but to pay for the unencumbered production of others with no more than whatever we may deem to be the sufficiently equivalent unencumbered production of our own. 3a.3. Economy therefore is this very fact, and very fact alone, of unencumbered, undiminished free trade, which in turn means that as no redundant cost whatever is imposed by actual economy, true free enterprise itself is impossible without economy as a common and universal fact. 4. We therefore establish how loss is prevented to the actual creditor. 4a. So long as debtors pay for represented property at the rate of consumption or depreciation, no loss can exist to the creditor if the property defaults to the creditor upon non-payment, because the remaining value of every subject property at all times suffices to collect the remainder of every existent promissory obligation. 4A1. Neither can any loss or excessive cost exist to the debtor, who all the while pays for no more than what they consume. 4A2. All the while, maximum potential prosperity is perpetually sustained, not only by whatever rewards of having earned exist, but to the maximal further extent of legitimate creditworthiness. 4A3. Excessive borrowing is impossible merely from the necessary enforcement of legitimate creditworthiness. In other words, we never let you borrow unless you can afford to service the debt above all your other further obligations. 4B. Likewise, inflation and deflation are impossible, for our obligatory schedule of payment itself maintains an inflation and deflation-free circulation without even any regulation whatever. 4B1. A perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between obligation, remaining value of represented property, and representative circulation, therefore, enforces every natural power to maintain the value of every unit of the currency. 5. Thus only a strict adherence to the natural process of monetization sustains any possible volume of industry, even without regulation and virtually without cost. 5A. The resultant mathematically perfected economy alone, therefore, replicates the pattern of free, unimpeded barter, with the additional advantages of 4A1. The universal interchangeability of a currency. 5A2. Sustaining the further prosperity made possible by legitimate enforced creditworthiness. 5A3. Elimination of purported monetary risk. And 5A4. And of accomplishing all these purposes virtually without cost or even regulation. According to these vital observations, we understand that the purported central banking systems which have been imposed upon the world cannot possibly provide credit as they falsely claim, for in fact they neither give up nor risk anything to create their purposed obfuscation of the currency. On the contrary, they merely intervene upon the actual creditor and debtor to no more than publish the promissory note of the latter, and to pretend preposterously that the debtor must borrow their own promissory note from a mere publisher, subject to a further crime of interest. 6. We therefore prove the unauthorizable consequences of contemporary purported banking systems. 6.1. The first crime of this purposed obfuscation is that the banking system presumes to acquire title to the promissory notes they merely publish. To the principle of an actually non-existent debt to the purported banking system,